Hey everybody, and welcome to the Oregon Chocolate Festival. I'm so happy to be here with you virtually. My name is Durfee. I'm a pastry chef instructor at the Culinary Institute of America, and I'm here today to show you how to make a wonderful chocolate torte. Stick around, it's gonna be a lot of fun. All right, let's get started on the recipe. Step number one, I'm gonna prepare a 10-inch cake pan by taking a piece of pre-cut circle of parchment. I'm going to spray the pan with a little bit of pan spray. I'll put my parchment paper into the pan, and then I'm going to take just a little bit of flour, and we'll get that around the outside of the pan. By preparing the pan like this, it's going to give the cake something to grip and to hold on to as the cake rises up in the inside of the pan. You can kind of imagine if you were a rock climber and you were going to be scaling a rock wall. The wall may look slick, but close up, there's going to be little hand holds and footholds for you to grip. That's exactly what the purpose of the flour is, to kind of give the cake something to grip as it's going to be rising up the sides of that pan. So I'm going to start by taking the chocolate and some butter. We're going to melt this over barely simmering water. I have the water already turned on. I'm going to turn it down very low, and then I'll put the chocolate over the heat. So we want to be careful whenever we're melting chocolate that we don't go over too high heat. The chocolate could scorch. I'm just going to set this here, and in fact, in just a second, I'll turn the heat off altogether. We're going to separate eggs for this recipe. When we're separating our eggs, crack the egg on the tabletop, not just on the side of the bowl. And then we're going to separate the egg from pouring it from shell to shell. So the egg whites separated from the yolks. Right? Try to avoid pouring it through your fingers, especially if you just handle the butter as I did. You don't want to get bits of fat mixed in with your egg whites. We're going to look for very clean egg whites to whip to make a nice, stable and thick, fluffy meringue. So while the chocolate and butter are melting, I'm going to start whipping the egg yolks. So we've got brown sugar and white sugar in this recipe. I'm going to whip the egg yolks with the brown sugar. Whipping the egg yolks with the brown sugar is going to take about 4 or 5 minutes. You want it to be really thick and fluffy and to hold a ribbon. Okay, I've been whipping these egg yolks for about 4 or 5 minutes. And you can see right now that the color is really thick. The eggs are really thick and the color is really light. And so if I whip them like this, you can see they hold a little bit of a shape and what we have called a slight ribbon. It means that they've been properly aerated. When we're whipping egg whites to fold into a cake, we're going to create what we call a meringue. There's some general rules of thumb to help ensure making a great, nicely textured meringue that's full of air and also stable to hold that air so you can fold it into your cake base. Number one rule is start off with room temperature egg whites. And so I actually have room temperature eggs. I've left them out at room temperature for several hours so they're not going to be too cold. We're going to whip the egg whites by themselves on a medium speed until they become frothy and opaque, and they sort of resemble the foam that you would find if you pour a beer into a glass. So now that my egg whites are getting frothy, you can see inside the bowl, they look like I described, like the froth on the foam on the head of a beer. I'm going to start adding my sugar. When we add the sugar, don't dump it in all at once. We want to add it gently, gradually, like a fine spring rain. So you don't actually have to use your fingers for this job. Just want to emphasize that we do want to do it gradually, so I'm just doing this for show. In fact, I can just shake the sugar in here, but we want to do this over the course of several minutes. Don't rush this process. Give it the meringue time to develop. You want to be careful that you don't overdo this. You also want to remember you have to do it in the proper order. So it's important that egg yolks are first and the egg whites after. And we never really want to turn them off. You want to make this a complete process from start to finish. This meringue is going to be folded into the cake base, so it's important that I don't whip the meringue until it's too dry. And so we look at it now, it's nice and creamy, it's shiny, it holds a peak, it looks like shaving cream. So once my meringue is done, I have to use it right away. So we really have to make sure that we're ready to go. So I've got all my ingredients prepared. I'm going to take the chocolate off the stove. I'm actually going to use my larger whisk right now. And we're going to add first into the melted chocolate the egg yolks. And we want to make sure that we're not going to wind up with any little lumps of unincorporated meringue. What remains in here, we want it to be creamy. So in we go. Now we're going to blend this in, cut it in, try to work quickly. And when the meringue is mostly incorporated, and you can see it, the color becoming uniform, I'm going to add my dry ingredients. I have a little bit of flour, just a small of cocoa powder, some baking soda powder, baking powder, and a little bit of salt. I'm actually going to sift this over the base because I've created such a nice foam. I don't want to have to beat it in too aggressively. So by sifting it, distributes it more carefully. And now we're going to fold this mixture carefully into the rest. Try to do this in as few strokes as possible. With every time that I'm folding, I lose a little bit of volume in the cake. I don't see any more little bits of unincorporated flour. I'm going to transfer the mixture to my prepared pan. Don't worry if it's not perfectly level across the top. It'll all even out once we're in the oven. You're going to pull this cake out. That is set. I'm going to leave it here to cool off. This cake is going to collapse a little bit in as it cools. We're going to let it cool completely before we start on the next part of the project. Hey, well, our cake is cooling. It's time to start making the chocolate ganache glaze. Okay, after we finally chop the chocolate, we're going to melt it over barely simmering water. Okay, next we're going to combine cream and milk. I've got that both together here in the same pitcher. A little bit of corn syrup, and we'll bring this to a boil and then pour it over the chopped chocolate. Okay, when the cream comes to a simmer, we're going to pour it over the melted chocolate. It doesn't matter if the chocolate's completely melted or not. Now we want to blend this so that the chocolate does become thoroughly melted. I'll stir it right from the middle until it forms a nice and thick, sort of elastic texture, nice and smooth, and we're looking for it to be shiny and well emulsified. Okay, now I need to let this chocolate mixture cool completely until it reaches room temperature. So we're just going to set that aside. And while that's cooling, let's take a look at our cake. It's time to unmold it. So you see how the cake has sort of fallen while it's cool, right? I'm going to use an offset spatula or just use a butter knife to kind of rim around the outside of the cake. Don't worry if some of the parts crack off. That's just sort of to be expected. So I have a little cardboard circle here that's going to make it easier for me to unmold this cake. I have to give it a little tap. Hello. Okay. There we go. So extra pieces here we can just sort of brush off. If you notice that you have a real, like a deeper rim, you can just sort of trim that to make it level. Just cut like a little bit here off the edge. Here, just kind of show you what I'm talking about. So we've completely cooled our cake and we've completely cooled the chocolate ganache. And so it's thickened up, sitting at room temperature for a couple of hours. And so at this point, we're going to divide up the mixture. I'm going to take about 1/3 of the ganache and we're going to whip it and use it to mask the cake. And then we're going to melt the ganache that remains and use that to pour over the top as a glaze. All right? And using a regular hand whisk, just going to soften it up just a little bit. Doesn't take much. Just compare the color of one to the other. Obviously lighter. Okay. And now we're just going to take this mixture. We're going to use it to spread on the cake. So we're using this to sort of seal any of the imperfections that are on the surface of the cake. Remember we had cut away part of that earlier. So this is going to set it and make it look a little bit more uniform across the top. We can also take a little of the ganache and we can seal the sides, the edges. So for that I'm going to use a smaller offset spatula like this. I'm just going to run this around the edge like so, just to sort of seal it. Now we're just going to clean out the edges just a little bit. Make it as smooth as we can on the surface. So when we pour the glaze, we want it to have a nice cascade over the edge. Really nice and smooth across the top. Okay, we're ready for the final step, which is the glazing. So we're going to set up our glazing station. I've got a rack, wire rack, and then a tray. And I've lined the tray with a piece of parchment paper. You could use plastic wrap. You want to have something to capture whatever the glaze that drips off so that if we need to, we can reuse that. And I'm going to take the ganache that we made earlier. It's been sitting here. And even though we gave it time to thicken up, I'm going to deliberately melt it again. So it's basically going to be like it was when we first started. I had a little bit of the leftover whipped ganache that I didn't need. And so I'm going to add it right back in here to the rest. So again, we've got our pan of barely simmering water. We're going to put the ganache over this, slowly soften it up. All right, so still got a couple little bumps in there. So I don't need to get it too hot. I just want to make sure that the lumps are out. Give it a second longer. Okay, we're going to pour the glaze onto the cake. Because I just had it over the warm water, make sure you wipe off the bottom of the bowl so we don't drip. Then we're just going to pour this all at once right into the middle of the cake. There's a little spot right there. You want to be careful. You can't do this for too long, or you'll see some marks. That looks pretty good all around. Going through here just to give it a little shift, just to ensure that it doesn't stick to the rack itself. So that's it. Our chocolate torte. I'm looking forward to seeing you all at the presentation.